It's great to be here with you this afternoon. And as Dan mentioned, my name is Amy, and I teach in the business faculty here, and I also serve on staff side in the area of strategic communications. And we understand that leading well certainly begins with loving well. So I'm really excited about Sandi's message today. I think it's of ultra importance to us as we are working with Generation Z on a daily basis and looking forward to welcoming Generation Alpha soon. And we certainly want to know how we can care well for these generations. As a university, we do seek to develop transformational leaders and hope to develop leadership skills in our students, our staff, and our faculty. So it's really wonderful that we're able to partner with the CBAC in this way and to be with you here today. Thank you again for participating in Masterclass, and thank you for providing thoughtful leadership in the areas where you serve.
So excited to have Sandi join us today. Sandi is the next generation pastor at RiverCross in St. John, and just so excited to have Sandi's expertise. Sandi is a former CBAC staff member, but serving exceptionally well at RiverCross as a next generation pastor. And Sandi has a huge heart for passing faith on and sharing faith with our next generations. And so in her work with youth and children, Sandi has just displayed incredible compassion and empathy and just great wisdom in leading students and children. And so we're thrilled to have Sandi join us today. So welcome, Sandi. I'm so glad that you're here with us this afternoon.
Thank you very much, Dan. Like Dan said, my name is Sandi. I am really excited to be here with you to talk about one of my very favorite topics. Everyone in my real life is sick of hearing me talk about this. So thank you for being here to spend this time with me. I actually became a youth pastor not very long ago. I started during the height of pandemic restrictions in 2021, and I came to pastoring from camp ministry. So it was a new role for me. And really quickly, I discovered that if we're going to love our youth and our young adults really well, then we need to pay a little bit of attention to how we can meet them where they are, because where they are is really different from where all of us were when we were youth, even for those of us who were youth not so very long ago. So I'm excited to dig into this topic a little bit more and to kind of guide our conversation. I think most of us have probably heard before the analogy that culture and worldview is a lot like the water that a fish swims in a fishbowl. The water influences the health of the fish. The fishbowl represents, the extent of the known world to the fish. You don't blame the fish for what is in the fishbowl. That is just the world that they're aware of. And the fish isn't really aware of the water that they're swimming in. And I think this can be really helpful for us as we seek to develop some self-awareness about our own understanding of the world and of others and of ourselves and of God. And where I stop liking this analogy is just where it encourages me to think of my fishbowl as mine. And then what happens if another fish tries to enter my fishbowl? They're going to ruin my water, right? And I've grown accustomed to the water the way that I like it. And another fish is going to interfere with that for me. And so at best, what I can hope, if my worldview is the fishbowl, then, when you go to a pet store and you buy a goldfish and you bring it home and you're going to put it in your tank, you can't put it straight into the tank. You have to set the little bag floating on top of the water until they're the same temperature. So if another fish is going to join my fishbowl, then it needs to acclimatize itself to my way of doing things. Otherwise, it's going to make things complicated for me. And so as we think about working really well with our emerging generations and loving them really well and creating circumstances for them to thrive, I think it's maybe more helpful if we think of the world that we're living in as an ecosystem. And I've chosen this picture where it's really hard to distinguish different plants quite deliberately, because if you have ever gone for a walk in the forest, then what you see are these tall, beautiful trees that are creating a climate. And they're set and they're secure. They've got a good foundation. And at the base of all of these trees, you have new life springing up in every direction. You have small trees, you have ferns, you have different kinds of mosses, all of which is dependent on this well-established forest. And the well-established forest is dependent on the new life that springs up from its shelter. You can even see in this image that some logs have fallen over. Their time is up, whether it be due to storm or overpopulation or whatever. And as they have fallen down, new life has sprung up where they were. They create the foundation for something new to grow. And so I think if we are going to love our emerging generations well, then we need to meet them in this spirit and be attentive to those things that maybe we need to let go of to create space for them to thrive. And also consider how we can encourage their new life to grow, because we need them as much as they need us. And so rather than expecting them to get acclimatized to our fishbowl, I want us to think together about how we can thrive together by loving each other really well. And this little statistic for me, a disclaimer, is that I am just a person who, like all of you, really wants to love these new generations well. I'm not an expert in my field. I just really want to get good at it. And so I am indebted to people much smarter than me, like Dan Pike, who shared some of his notes, and to the people at Springtide Research Institute and Barna Group who are providing some of the research. And for me, this statistic really captures why it's so important that we work together to love our generations well. So 24% of young people with no adult mentors never feel like their life has meaning or purpose. And just one adult relationship reduces that percentage to 6%. And 21% of young people with no meaningful interactions per day say that they never feel like their life has meaning and purpose. And just one meaningful interaction a day reduces that number to 4%. And when they speak of young people, they're talking 25 down to the age 13. And for me, this is both a really sobering statistic, and it's also a really hopeful statistic, because there is so much that we can do with the body of Christ that we have been given to meet these needs. And the body of Christ that God has given us is composed of all generations, different trees at different stages of their growth, who have different ways of supporting and encouraging the new life that is springing up in our churches and in our communities. And I have this slide here mostly to provide you some framework for who I am speaking about when I speak about Gen Z and Gen Alpha, because it's a little bit alarming for me, a millennial who thinks of myself as young. There are now two generations who are younger than me. So Gen Z, those are our young adults down through to high school and our oldest middle schoolers. And then Gen Alpha is making up the majority of our middle school youth groups now. And their generation is still being born. They'll be complete in a couple of years. So that's the people group that we are talking about. And I want to first give us some understanding into what their world is like, what their formative years have been like, and how that has shaped them as people. Because if we're going to love them well, we need to know them well. And so we'll start with just a little bit of conversation about Gen Z. And so if I think of some characteristics that represent Gen Z really well, one of them is that they are open to change. And this is very interesting because Gen Z has seen like the biggest and fastest transition in terms of what's available to them digitally, what's available to them technologically, what their social media world is like. Their formative years, their teen years, their young adult years have been in the midst of this global pandemic when all of us have had to figure out how to do things a little differently. And so this generation is really adaptable. They're really entrepreneurial. They're really innovative. They're open to doing things in a new way, which is really exciting, because if there's one thing I think we can all agree on, we need to begin to do things in a new way as we start to emerge to our regular rhythms. This generation is also really social media minded. They've been around for the good, the bad, and the ugly. They've lived much of their social lives through social media. And there are things about that which have benefited them, even as there are things which have been challenges that arise from that. Because this generation is so connected digitally, they have a more global perspective. They have a more diverse perspective. They're more aware of global and cultural trends. And this has contributed to them having a more open and compassionate worldview, I think. And they're also just more diverse culturally. They are growing up with a more diverse sampling of people, which again contributes to a bit more of an open-minded perspective as they view the world. And what's interesting to me is that this generation is more comfortable living in gray spaces where there isn't an absolute yes or no, black or white. There's a lot of gray. And they're more comfortable there than a lot of us are. I have this statistic here. It's dated a few years ago now, but what's interesting about it to me isn't so much the topic, it's the comfort level in occupying uncertain spaces. So if the left-hand circle represents how a pool of engaged Christians would understand gender, what we see there is that it's pretty concrete. And if we look at the right-hand circle, which represents a pool of all Generation Z, what I'm interested in is how much of that circle represents subjectivity or uncertainty and the comfort level of having that as an answer. So if they're asked what gender is primarily based on, 12% aren't sure, and 33% say what a person feels like. There is a comfort in this ambiguity that is maybe a little foreign to those of us who are a little bit older and like to see the world more concretely. And so because of this, understandably, this is a generation that is more sexually fluid. They are more open to exploring their gender and their sexuality and to those things changing over time. And then my next little category here, I have a little bit of a beef with, and it's not because of the words themselves. It's because of the connotation that these words sometimes carry. So often I have read a popular publication that describes Gen Z as post-Christian, which is true because what post-Christian means is that particularly Western youth are growing up in a culture where Christianity is no longer the norm. What some authors and some people hear when they hear the word post-Christian is that Gen Z is anti-family and they are anti-Jesus and they are spoiling the water. That's not what that word means in its truest form, but there is a connotation with that. When in reality, what Gen Z is anti-Christendom, if they're anti-anything, right? They're really concerned with social justice, and they're really concerned with the way that the church, particularly in the West, has perpetuated systems of injustice rather than contributing to justice in the world. And so this generation doesn't care so much about what the church says or even what the church does unless the church is interested in matters of social justice. And so this generation has a heightened concern for that, particularly as it concerns marginalized people groups, but also as it concerns care for the environment, recycling, being a good steward of the creation God has given to us. And in this way, I think these emerging generations have a really prophetic voice in the life of the church, calling us back to what God has called us to. Gen Z is also interested in holistically healthier lifestyles, care for the planet, eating well, exercising well, being good stewards of what God has given us to steward. And they're also a visual generation because they're so plugged in digitally and socially. They're visual. Why read a thing when you can watch a thing? And so YouTube is rivaling Google as the most popular search engine. And also these visual platforms like Instagram and YouTube and TikTok both allow young people to shape the kind of content that they're feeding themselves with and to contribute content to the broader conversation that they're participating in. So in this way, they're given a voice in what is going on in the world that is also shaping them. Something to me that is really fascinating that I have noticed is the relationship between social media use, parasocial relationships, and the church. And I think I first noticed this because I became a pastor at a time when I couldn't see any of the people that I was pastoring. And it was several months before I was able to do things in person. And I am still meeting people today that know me because they watch church on YouTube, and I haven't had an opportunity to meet them yet. And it's created this really interesting phenomenon. So parasocial relationships, if you're not familiar with this term, it's a relationship that exists between someone who is consuming content and someone who is creating content. And the most wholesome and relatable example of this I think I can give to you would be Mr. Rogers. And the reason so many children of my generation loved Mr. Rogers isn't necessarily because his show was dynamic. He didn't have the most exciting animation. He didn't have the most exciting plot. We believed that Mr. Rogers cared about us specifically and individually. And so if I have my favorite TikTok creator and I follow their account and they post 5 times every day, and I feel like I'm involved in their breakfast and in their crafts and in what color they paint their living room, then I form a vested relationship with this person. I feel like I have input into their lives and I feel like we have a relationship. And I hope that someday soon, someone much smarter than me digs into what this means for the church, particularly during the global pandemic, because I can't tell you if it's good or if it's bad, but I can tell you that there are people in my world who have this kind of relationship with me. And it creates for me a heightened responsibility with how I interact with social media, how I interact online, and how I even interact with people that I might encounter in my everyday lived life, who might be one of those people who knows me from YouTube that I haven't had an opportunity to meet yet. And particularly as we deal with Generation Z and our emerging Generation Alpha, I think this kind of relationship is a new kind of influence that we will have whether we want to have it or not. We will be this kind of figure in their lives. So Generation Alpha, they are 12 and younger this year. And so when we speak about Generation Alpha, because it's not yet a complete generation, we're speaking more about their lived experiences at this point than we are their set characteristics, because they're still becoming who they are going to be. And when we think about the things that have shaped the lives of these young people, in 2010, iPads happen, and the whole landscape of digital interaction is changed by that. And then in 2011, we start to get our new Generation Alpha babies. And they're really this first generation that from their earliest age has access to screens. And we don't know yet what that looks like when this generation grows up, but we know that it is something that they are experiencing in their formative years that none of us experienced in our formative years. And then when they are around 10, there is a global pandemic and their school is disrupted and their socialization is disrupted and their whole way of life is disrupted. And then as things begin to return to a regular rhythm in 2022, we hear about the war in Ukraine, which shapes the entire global political landscape and the entire narrative that makes up their own understanding of the world. And they're only 12. And so we don't know what this yields yet when they get bigger, but we know that none of us had to wrestle with this when we were 12. And I know that it is a lot for my 30-year-old brain. So I know that our 12-year-old friends need meaningful relationships to help them process all of this in a way that is constructive. We can know some things about Gen Alpha because there's no rigid cutoff where 13-year-olds are one way and then suddenly everyone 12 years old and younger is an entirely different way. So they're going to share a lot of the characteristics of Gen Z. So we know that they're exceptionally digital in a way that none of us can comprehend. My 8-year-old niece is way better at using my phone than I am. We know that the way they socialize is different. It's predominantly through social media. We know that they are more connected to their peers and to just the broader world all of the time than any young people have been before. But we also know that most of their socialization is happening this way. And so in-person relationships, which they haven't been able to have outside of their family or their isolation bubbles for the past couple of years, those can create real anxiety for them because they're skills that they haven't been able to practice very much. And we know that they're highly visual. Again, why read it if you can watch it on YouTube? We also know that this group of individuals is resilient, because they've had to be. They've adapted through change after change. They've tried online school, they've tried in-person school, they've tried hybrid school. and they're resilient. They try again. We also know that they're innovative. Like Gen Z before them, they're increasingly open to change because their lives have changed so much already just in their first 12 years of living. And we know that, like Gen Z, they have heightened concern for justice, for living well. And for them, this is expressed very often in environmental consciousness. They care for creation in a very good way. And as we look to the future, we have all just practiced working from home for the past several years, and we've discovered that in most occupations, that's really possible. So we know this is going to be a mobile generation, able to work from wherever and start again in a new place. And we know that this is a global generation. They're connected to what is going on globally in unprecedented ways. Not that any of us like to use that word anymore, but the global narrative really shapes their personal lived narratives. So political events happening in the States shape their narrative. War in Ukraine shapes their narrative. The pandemic shapes their narrative. They're connected to what is going on in the world. And we also know that as connected as this generation is, they are lonely because social relationships, parasocial relationships, online interaction doesn't substitute real lived interaction. And we know that social media encourages us to present a face that is different maybe than what we are like in real life. It presents our best self. And we know that this can contribute to mental health challenges. Nevertheless, we know that this generation is equipped in the way that none of the rest of us are to give shape and direction to the future. And we have the opportunity now to journey with them as they begin to co-create and contribute to the conversation that is going to lead us all forward. This is an idea that I shamelessly stole from Dan Pike. But here we have tracking the words of the year from Oxford for the lifespan of Generation Alpha. And the first several years of their life, it's kind of cute. You know, there's app and there's cloud and there's hashtag, there's selfie. There's the year we all got really angry because it was an emoji, the crying, laughing emoji. And then it takes a turn. I wonder what could have happened around 2016, but there's post-truth and fake news and toxic and climate emergency. And then in 2020, they couldn't even choose. So you got words of an unprecedented year, COVID-19 and lockdown and social distancing and cancel culture and super spreader and Black Lives Matter. And in 2021, the word of the year is vax. And this is my favorite. In 2022, there was a poll and the internet got to choose. And what they chose was goblin mode. And if you don't know what goblin mode is, I want you to imagine you go home from a really long day of work and you put on your biggest hoodie and you wrap yourself in blankets and you put on something silly on Netflix and you eat chips. And then you sit there in the dark in your pile of empty snap wrappers all wrapped up in your blankets and you're in goblin mode. Another word for this that is maybe not so cutesy is languishing. We've probably all read those articles that describe our state of being post-pandemic. We're not thriving, we're languishing. And all of us, even the grown-up humans, are having a really hard time reorienting ourselves and rebuilding our mental health. And how much more is this true for our younger generations? So it will not be surprising for us to know then that Gen Z and Gen Alpha are experiencing struggles with their mental health that a lot of us at this young age didn't have to experience in such a widespread degree. And so I have some statistics here that are a little bit sobering. So 1 in 3, a third of our young people report feeling completely alone much of the time. And nearly 40% of them feel that they have no one to talk to and they feel left out. 69% have 3 or fewer meaningful interactions a day. Nearly 40% of them say they feel like they have no one to talk to and no one really knows them well. Sorry, I just got to move my little bubble here. More than 1 in 4 young people say they have 1 or fewer adults in their life that they can talk to, they can turn to if they need to. And this statistic here really got me. 61% of our young people agree that the adults in my life don't truly know how much I am struggling with my mental health, and almost half report feeling moderately or extremely depressed. And what was interesting and hit me a little bit heavy was this set of statistics here, where the blue line represents our younger generations who attend religious gatherings, and the darker blue line represents the total sample of young people. And what was interesting to me is that the difference really isn't that big. It's no more than 2 to 3% on each line, where they report saying, no one really knows me well. I feel like no one understands me. I feel completely alone. I have nobody to talk to. And then if you combine that statistic with what we saw before, so 73% of religious young people report that spiritual practices positively impact their mental health. 66% report that a religious or spiritual life matters for their mental health. But still, that 61% say the adults in my life don't really know how much I'm struggling. 47% report that they're moderately or extremely depressed. And what this suggests to me is that Jesus is helping with their mental health, and the church isn't always meeting them in a meaningful way as they struggle with their mental health. So I wanted to maybe talk a little bit about how we can do that. How can we meet them at the point where they need us the most and love them really well? And so I pulled here some statistics that speak about how young people are relating to the church right now. And I love this quote from the Connected Generation report. This generation doesn't just want to know whether Christianity is true. They want to see that it is good. And so compared to 26% who want to know most that the Christian Bible is true and trustworthy, 48% care that it promotes good in the world around them, that it does something meaningful, that it contributes to justice in some way. They want to see that the church is actually doing what it says it will do. And I have some quotes here. I'm sorry, I'm just going to exit us out for a second because my little chat bubble's in my way. Then we're going to go back. Now I can see. I pulled some quotes here from this report of young people who were talking about those things that make them feel isolated from the church. This one is from Lucy. She's 23. And she said she didn't see the church putting their money where their mouth was. She saw members of the church judging people for coming into mass in soccer shorts or, silly things that shouldn't matter. It's just kind of that hypocrisy, I guess. My least favorite thing the church ever did was they bought a $15,000 nativity set from Jerusalem or something like that. It was this huge hand-carved set. And I mean, it was gorgeous, but also that wasn't $15,000 that was going to anything that would actually help people. I think those kind of things caused me more distress and caused me to feel less like I belonged in that space. And for people who are on the intersections of a lot of different identities, that can do a lot of harm. And I don't want anyone to get the wrong idea, because I love big, ridiculous youth gatherings as much as the other person. But if where we are investing most of our time and most of our budget and most of our energy is on ourselves and not on bettering the community around us, then we're not meeting the generation that we care about most in the place that they care about the most. And we're creating another barrier between us and them. Or Cassia, who is 14, said this: I do consider myself religious. I'm a Christian. I do believe that there is a higher power. I'm just not exactly, I don't know how to say it. There's a lot of stuff in the Bible that was written there that is kind of weird. I'm not sure how to feel about it. I just believe that everyone should be treated well, forgiven. I'm so bad at explaining my religious feelings. I just want to be a good person, like Jesus's way. I want to be able to help people. And this, for me, speaks to the way that we as a church engage in social conversation. Are we creating barriers for our youth to love people well? Are we creating barriers to them loving their friends well? Are we creating barriers between ourselves and, for instance, members of the LGBTQ community? Are we hitting heavy the not affirming and not doing the welcoming piece well? Because if we're not loving well, if we're not freely loving well the way that Jesus loves well, we're creating another barrier between us and our youth by telling them that they can't love their friends. And then this quote from Shonda, who's 24, it kind of goes back to the whole just pray about it if you're going through a hard time, which sometimes you need something that's more tangible. I've struggled with this, especially growing up, because it feels kind of dismissive. I've actually never seen or been to a church that acknowledges mental health or anything really within what they're preaching. So are we creating space where they can speak about how they're really feeling and their actual lived experience and be met with practical tools and helps and supports? Because if we're not meeting this next generation in those issues that they care about, are we contributing to social justice? Are we loving people well? Are we supporting people's mental health? If we're not participating in these conversations, then we're not meeting them in those spaces that they care about the most. And we will contribute to an increase of what we already see, which is distrust of the church. There was a time when we would be relied upon simply because we were pastors or simply because we are church leaders. And that time isn't now, because we know too much and we've seen too much and our history is complicated. And now what this generation wants to see from us is that we're changing and we're engaging and we're contributing to justice. And so you can see just quickly in these statistics here that even among those who are affiliated with a religious tradition, more than 50% said they don't really trust large religious institutions. And who can blame them in this narrative when so many large evangelical churches have revealed themselves to be perpetuating systems of abuse? It is not all doom and gloom, though, because we also see statistics that show us that these emerging generations are really valuing their faith and they are seeking something more. And so 59% of Gen Z reports that they are more open to God today than they were before the pandemic. And you can see that that's quite an increase from older generations. And even 68% of our younger generations say that over the course of the pandemic, their faith has either become stronger or it has stayed the same. Where there's some challenge and some disconnect is their relationship with the church has shifted. They're less likely to put trust in the institutions that claim to belong to Jesus. And a quarter of young people say that their relationship with faith leaders has become weaker over the course of the pandemic. And you can see that kind of playing out tangibly in this little graph too. If you list all of the people that someone might be able to turn to, a young person might be able to turn to when they needed an adult to support them, religious leaders rank rather low on this list, particularly compared to close friends, parents, guardians, other family members. And we'll talk a little bit in a moment about how that can reflect a shift in some of our behavior as well. And even if we look at practices that younger people are turning to help them support their mental health, we'll see things like cooking, painting, sculpting, therapy or counseling, journaling or writing, breathing exercises or routines. And what's interesting to me is that what isn't on the list necessarily is increased church gatherings or prayer meetings or even youth group. So to kind of sum up all of that research that I dumped on you all at the same time, among our younger generations, what we're seeing is an increased distrust of large institutions, an increased spiritual hunger, an increased range in what they consider life-giving practices, increased challenges to their mental health, increased concern for social justice and advocacy, increased digital engagement generally, and increased parasocial relationships. And I'm going to unpack here some suggestions of what I think that could mean for us. All right, so I'm going to move on to this last section, which for me is kind of the fun section. What does this mean for us as we try to love Gen Z and Gen Alpha really well and meet them where they are? And first, I think it means we need to start with relationships because we are not automatically reliable just because we are church leaders. And in fact, we may be less reliable because we are church leaders. And so I actually sat down with my youth group and I asked them, if there was one thing that you wish the adults in your life knew about you, what would that one thing be? And these were some of their answers. The first was, I wish they would talk to us instead of just talking about us. Or I wish they would stop trying to decide what we want and what we think, and instead just ask us what we want and what we think. One of my grade 9 students told me that sometimes he just feels like the adults in his life aren't interested in hearing his point of view. They want to tell him what comes next and tell him what is right, but don't want to listen to what he has to say about things. One of my grade 10 students shared this with me. I think one thing the adults should know is that we aren't growing up in the same world that they did. That doesn't mean that they're wrong, but we just have a different view. Overwhelmingly, formal research that is better than just me sitting down with my one group of teenagers reports that 79% of young people agreed that they're more likely to listen to the adults in their life if they know that they care about them. And 65% of them said a person's expertise doesn't matter if they don't care about me. And so as we try to meet our youth and our young adults where they are, the first step is just listening to what they have to say, valuing their thoughts, meeting them where they are, demonstrating that we care about them and all of them. We care about what they think. And I think out of that, we're better able to meet them where they are. And I think it requires us to be prepared to accept some things that are maybe a little difficult. And one of those could be that the way we have been doing things isn't the most effective way that we could be doing things. It could be that weekly youth group might not be the most effective or important thing that we do anymore. And again, I'm not an expert. I'm just finding this to be really true in my context, because as we're emerging from the pandemic, what I'm seeing is a lot of youth who haven't had opportunity to practice being together in large settings, and they find those large settings really overwhelming. I am also finding that what they need is more personal connection, more personal relationships, and they're just not able to get that in the large group setting. And maybe for you, your youth are still finding those large gatherings to be life-giving. And I'm not saying we should never do them, because they're tons of fun and everyone can run and play. And there's nothing quite like being in a group of 50 teenagers that are all jumping and singing, and it's wonderful. But that might not be where I need to be spending most of my time or most of my budget or most of my energy, because that might not be where I'm able to meet their needs the best. What might be something that they need are smaller, more intentional gatherings. My best friend that I have today at 30 years old is my best friend because when we were 13, our youth leaders decided that we needed each other. And they met with us every Wednesday until we started hanging out on our own. And so maybe part of our role looks like facilitating relationships, seeking out those people who need someone who'll be able to walk with them and hear them and support them in their life. And I think a harder pill to swallow, even than the idea that large gatherings might not be it for this season, is that you might not be the leader that your youth need the most. And in fact, I would go as far to say that we are not the leader that our youth need the most. What they need most is Jesus. And I will not always be the one who is best poised to guide every youth to Jesus. I want to be, if it depended on how much I really cared about them, then, and how much you really cared about them, then you could be that leader for every person. But sometimes they need someone else. They need someone who relates to them differently. They need a different voice from yours to speak into the conversation. So sometimes meeting our youth really well where they need to be met looks like handing over the discipleship of them to someone else and partnering alongside that leader, giving them the tools and resources that they need to support them really well. Or sometimes it might look like supporting the parents really well, really coming alongside of them and championing them, because if 74% of people are going to their parents when they need them and only 8% are coming to us, then our time and attention for some of our youth needs to be directed to their parents, because that's the relationship they're going to have for a lifetime. And if we are in a position to strengthen that and support that, then how much better if they find Jesus through their mom and dad than if they find Jesus through you and me. I also think it looks like being intentional with how we use our social media. And I sort of even think that it comes with a little bit of accepting that if you are a youth leader, you have no private social media account anymore. You just don't. All of your social media is kind of a public social media. And always, wherever you are pastor whoever or youth leader whoever, and they are forming this kind of parasocial relationship with online you, whether you want them to or not. And since they're there anyway, why not make it content that is meaningful and helpful? My best advice for all adult humans is to download TikTok. It's a terrible, horrible black hole of time wasting. And it's weird and it's confusing, but it's where our youth and young people are spending a lot of their time. And we need to know where they're spending a lot of their time. It also has this neat algorithm where if I send my youth TikToks by Christian creators and they watch them, their For You page will show them more TikTok videos that share that same kind of content. Or if they're using their social media, their TikTok, to watch some things that maybe aren't so edifying, their algorithm will continue to feed them things that are not so edifying. So we have opportunity to be a voice even into their TikTok algorithm, to share with them things that are life-giving and good and point them to Jesus. And that will help them find more of those things naturally. And then just learn about the things that matter to them. A lot of our youth, not just here, but everywhere, are wrestling with what it means to have a gender identity, right? They're thinking about the concept of gender in ways that no one ever told us to think about, and it never occurred to us to think about. And it's a topic that matters to them, and we can love them well by thinking a lot about it too, by reading about it, by learning to speak compassionately. Or if what they care about is care for the environment, we can learn to care about those things too. You can research local organizations that do community cleanup and partner with them and facilitate interactions between them and your youth. And your youth will notice if they have to explain things to you, or if you've gone and you've done research on your own because you care about what they care about. We also need to talk about the tough things. And we need to learn to talk about them with authenticity and humility. And the good news is your youth and young adults will not believe you anyway if you seem like you have all of the answers and you have a firm, concrete, yes or no, black or white response to their questions, because there's resistance to anyone who seems to have all of the answers. And meeting people where they're at looks like listening and inviting and hospitality and gathering around the table and have the conversation together. Maybe it looks like if your youth want to know what the Bible says about a specific topic, say, hey, let's find out together. We'll talk about it together. We'll read about it together. And there needs to be a safe space for them to speak about these things, because if not, their other options are they will learn about it through social media, or they will learn about it through their peers. And social media does not love them. And their peers are struggling with the same things that they are struggling to. And they need trusted adults who are a safe space to ask whatever they want to ask and know that they will be met with grace and compassion and humility and understanding. So sometimes meeting our young people where they are looks like having really weird conversations and settling in there. It also looks like leading with an open hand and giving them opportunity to lead because they have the best ideas. The most fun thing I ever get to do with my youth is we sit down and we have a planning meeting, and they tell me all of the things that they want to do. They tell me how they want to serve and where they want to serve and what they want to learn about and what games they want to play and what snacks they want to have. And then we work together to make those things happen because they have really good ideas. It also looks like creating diversity in worship experiences and in spiritual disciplines. What joy there is in learning how to pray and learning to love how to pray and not having to do it the prescribed way or not having to do it because you are forced to do it, but learning to love to spend time with God on your own. Remember that list of things that was reported that was life-giving practices that our young people intended to continue. It was cooking, it was art, it was therapy, it was journaling, it was breathing exercises. What if we came alongside them and helped them find God using those things He already gave them to love? What if we took their ideas and ran with them? If they want to do a worship night, that's great. Let's do a worship night. If they want to do a service night, that's great. Let's do a service night. And the fun thing about championing their ideas is that sometimes it is a big success and you get to help them enjoy that win. And sometimes it is a big flop and it doesn't go over well because it was the wrong time or the wrong idea or weather happened. And they have someone to walk them through that too, to take something that didn't work out and problem solve it and try again and use that to build their skills rather than having it be something they do on their own that results in discouragement and defeat. You get to walk with your youth through the wins and the losses. And the more we let them lead, I really think the better we all are, both because they are able to develop their own leadership skills and because they are wise and compassionate and concerned with social justice. And we will be a church that looks more like Jesus when we listen to the voice of our young people, as well as our older, more established leaders too. And this will also create more interest in our young people who don't just want to come and hear, they want to come and do. They want to practice what it looks like to live for Jesus. Another great quote from the Connected Generation report: young adults want the church to be a laboratory of leadership, not just a place of spirituality. And then this is my most important working with the next generation tip. And it's, do we meet them where they are when we remember that God is God? And I pulled Psalm 100 here for you, which is one of my favorite. Shout to the Lord, worship the Lord with gladness, come before him with joyful songs. Know that the Lord is God. And key to that is knowing that we are not. It is he who made us and we are his. We are his people, the sheep of his pasture. Enter his gates with thanksgiving, enter his courts with praise. Give thanks to him and praise his name. For the Lord is good and his love endures forever. His faithfulness continues through all generations. I get a great comfort in knowing that our God loves our emerging generations more than any of us do. And I get great comfort in the knowledge that God will continue to be as faithful to each new generation as he has been to generations before. And when I am seeking God in my leadership, when I am letting God be God and letting him lead me, it's much easier to let go of those things that have become important to us. It's much easier to know when I am not the leader that my youth needs to help them get through a struggle. It's much easier to know when my idea just isn't going to work and I need to try something new. And there's freedom and joy in leading that way when we remember that God is God and that we are not God. And then my final point, if I come back to this ecosystem thing, you will have moments when you are leading your youth when it is discouraging and it feels impossible and it feels too big and no one came to your planning meeting and you can't find enough volunteers to support this next idea. And I would like to remind you that not only is God God, but he brings life into places that feel like they're dead. We read in the book of John that unless a seed falls to the ground and dies, it remains only a seed. But if it dies, it creates new life. And so in those places in your ministry where you are feeling discouraged or you are feeling tired, know that God is working. If you look at the statistics for this new generation and they feel too big and they feel too overwhelming, know that God is working. And as we move forward, depending on him to help us lead this new generation, he will bring life to those places where life seems impossible.